The groom walked away mid-vows, calling her a nobody in front of everyone. But minutes later, the ground outside shook as black SUVs surrounded the chapel and hundreds of Navy SEALs stormed in, not to stop a threat, but to salute the woman he had just humiliated. The words hadn't even settled in the air when the microphone hit the floor with a hollow crack, echoing through the quiet chapel like a gunshot no one could unhear. "I can't marry someone like you," he had said, loud enough for every guest, every whispering voice, every curious eye to lock onto her at once. The bride stood frozen at the altar, her fingers still lightly wrapped around the bouquet, her knuckles pale under the soft white fabric of her gloves. She had chosen a simple dress, no glittering stones, no dramatic train, just clean lines and quiet elegance, something that felt honest. Now it only made her stand out more in the worst way possible. The silence lasted barely a second before it cracked, replaced by scattered laughter that spread like wildfire through the rows of guests. A woman in the front leaned toward her companion, her voice sharp and amused. "Did you see this coming? I mean, look at her." Another man chuckled, not even trying to lower his voice. Guy finally came to his senses. The groom, Richard, stepped back from her as if distance could erase the moment, adjusting his cufflinks with trembling hands, his face flushed not with shame, but irritation, like this entire scene was an inconvenience to him. "This was a mistake," he muttered, not even looking at her anymore. The bride didn't respond. She didn't chase him. She didn't beg. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed somewhere just beyond the crowd, as if focusing on anything else would make her break. The officiant stood awkwardly to the side, flipping pages that no longer mattered, unsure whether to speak or disappear. Somewhere in the back, a phone camera clicked, then another, until the quiet humiliation became a spectacle. "This is going everywhere," someone whispered. "Bride gets dumped at the altar, classic." The words floated to her ears, sharp and precise, but she didn't react. Her breathing stayed steady, even as her chest felt tight, like the air itself had turned heavy. If you're feeling this moment, if you've ever been judged before you could speak, go ahead and hit that like button, drop a comment, and stay with this story, because this isn't where it ends. Not even close. Just the night before, she had stood in a completely different room, surrounded by the same people now watching her fall apart. The engagement party had been held at Richard's family estate, a place so large it felt more like a museum than a home. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting light that reflected off polished floors and expensive jewelry, and she had felt it the moment she stepped in, like she didn't belong. She wore a simple navy dress that night, her hair tied back, her makeup minimal, and it wasn't long before the whispers started. "That's her," a woman in a sequin gown had said, her eyebrows lifting in disbelief. "I thought he was joking." A man beside her smirked into his glass. "Guess he likes charity work." The bride, still smiling politely at the time, had taken it all in without responding, her silence mistaken for weakness. Later, near the balcony, Richard's mother had approached her, pearls resting neatly against her collarbone like a symbol of everything she valued. "You should understand something," she had said quietly, her tone calm but cutting. "My son has a reputation, a future. Don't make him regret this." The bride had nodded once, not in submission, but acknowledgement, and turned away before the woman could say more. She remembered standing alone for a moment, looking out into the dark garden, wondering why something felt off, why the warmth she once felt with Richard had faded into something colder, something distant. He had found her later that night, his voice tense. "You know this isn't easy for me," he had said. "My family expects certain things." She had listened, trusting him, believing that whatever pressure he felt wouldn't change what they had. Now, standing at the altar, she realized how wrong she had been. Back in the present, the laughter hadn't fully died down. A young woman in the second row leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Are you okay?" she asked, though her smile suggested she didn't really care. The bride finally blinked, her gaze lowering for just a second before lifting again, steady and unreadable. "I'm fine," she said softly. It wasn't loud, but it carried just enough to quiet a few voices nearby. Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't even have a family here," he added, his words sharper now, more confident with the crowd behind him. "What kind of life were we even going to have?" That one landed. A few guests nodded, murmuring in agreement, their judgment now fully justified in their minds. The bride's fingers tightened slightly around the bouquet, a single petal slipping loose and falling to the floor. Still, she didn't cry. Not in front of them. Not like this. Somewhere deep inside, something held her steady. Not pride, not denial, but something stronger. Discipline. Control. The kind that doesn't come from an easy life. The kind that's earned. And just as the room began to settle into its cruel conclusion, as Richard turned fully away from her, ready to walk out and leave this moment behind like it meant nothing, a distant sound cut through the air. Low, faint, almost unnoticeable at first. But it was there, and it was getting closer. The first engine growl was low, so low it almost slipped past the moment, but it didn't fade. It grew, deeper, closer, intentional. A few guests turned toward the chapel doors, confusion replacing the smug amusement that had filled the room just seconds earlier. Then came another sound, tires crunching over gravel in perfect rhythm. Not one vehicle, many. The murmurs started again, but this time they weren't cruel, they were uncertain. "Do you hear that?" someone whispered. "Is something happening outside?" The bride stood still at the altar, but her eyes shifted slightly, her focus sharpening as that sound reached something buried deep inside her memory. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was precise, controlled, the kind of movement that meant organization, discipline. Outside, engines lined up one after another, a convoy forming with quiet authority. Inside, the tension thickened. Even Richard paused near the aisle, his earlier confidence slipping as he frowned toward the doors. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice no longer steady. Then, silence. A heavy, unnatural silence that pressed down on the room. And then it shattered. The chapel doors burst open with a violent force, slamming against the walls as boots struck marble in perfect unison. The sound echoed, sharp, synchronized, commanding. Guests gasped, some standing abruptly, others shrinking back into their seats as figures in dark tactical uniforms flooded the entrance. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They moved with precision, spreading down the aisle in controlled formation, their presence swallowing the room in seconds. Cameras lowered. Phones slipped from hands. No one laughed now. One by one, more operatives entered, forming lines along the sides of the chapel, their posture rigid, their eyes forward. And then someone whispered it, the word that changed everything. "SEALs." It spread quickly, quiet but electric. "Those are Navy SEALs." Outside, through the open doors, the scale became clear, rows of black SUVs stretching across the grounds, engines still running, doors open like they were waiting. Dozens? No, closer to 100. The sheer presence of it sent a wave of unease through the crowd. Richard took a step back, his face pale now, his voice tight. "Who are you people?" he demanded, but it came out weaker than before. No one answered him, because they weren't there for him. The formation stopped midway down the aisle. Perfect stillness, perfect symmetry. And then, in a single unified motion, every operative turned, not toward the groom, not toward the guests, but toward the bride. And they saluted. The sharp snap of hundreds of hands cut through the silence like a blade. Gasps rippled through the room, disbelief flooding every face as all eyes turned to the woman they had just mocked. The same woman they had called a nobody. A man stepped forward from the formation, his presence commanding without effort, his gaze fixed entirely on her. He stopped just a few feet away, his posture straight, his expression steady, but unmistakably respectful. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm, carrying across the stunned silence. "We've been looking for you." The bride didn't answer right away. For a brief moment, she just stared at him, her grip on the bouquet loosening as something inside her shifted. The past she had buried wasn't gone. The officer reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed folder, holding it out toward her with both hands. "Orders came through this morning," he continued. "Your record has been reinstated." A sharp breath was heard somewhere in the crowd. Someone dropped their phone. Richard's confusion turned to something closer to fear as he looked between them. "What record?" he asked, his voice strained, but no one answered. Because the answer stood right in front of him, and he had never once tried to see it. The bride finally moved, her hand steady as she took the folder. And the moment she did, everything about her changed. Her shoulders straightened, her posture sharpened. The quiet, overlooked woman at the altar seemed to disappear, replaced by someone else entirely. Someone trained. Someone controlled. Someone who wasn't surprised, just done hiding. She lifted her eyes to the officer, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room all over again. "Who authorized this?" she asked. The officer didn't hesitate. "Command did," he replied. "They sent us to bring you back." The words settled over the room like weight. Final. Unavoidable. Around them, the guests stood frozen, their earlier judgment collapsing into stunned silence. And outside, the engines of 100 black SUVs continued to rumble, waiting. The room held its breath as she stood there, the folder steady in her hands, the weight of everything finally catching up, not as pressure, but as clarity. Slowly, she opened it. Pages stamped, signatures marked, truths restored. Her name, cleared. Her record, rewritten the way it always should have been. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd as people leaned in, trying to understand what they had missed, what they had judged so quickly. The officer didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The truth was already louder than anything else in the room. She closed the folder gently, her fingers lingering on the cover for just a moment before lifting her gaze. Not at the guests. Not at the whispers. At him. Richard stood frozen, all the confidence gone, his face pale, his mouth slightly open as if he could still fix this. "I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of it. "You didn't tell me." She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he dropped the mic calm. Unshaken. "You didn't want to know," she replied softly. The words weren't loud, but they landed harder than anything else that day. He had no answer. Around them, the same people who had laughed now avoided her eyes, their silence louder than their cruelty had ever been. A few shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their heads. No one spoke. Because there was nothing left to say, she turned away from him without hesitation. No anger. No tears. Just finality. The bouquet slipped from her hand, falling onto the marble floor where it had all begun, forgotten now, like the version of her that stood there minutes ago. She stepped forward, past the stunned guests, past the judgment, past the life that had tried to shrink her into something smaller. The line of seals parted instantly, creating a path without a word, their presence no longer overwhelming, but honoring. As she walked, every step felt different. Not heavier, lighter, like she wasn't carrying anything anymore. Outside, the sunlight hit her eyes as she crossed the threshold, the low hum of engines still steady, still waiting. One of the SUV doors was already open. Not demanded, not forced, offered. She paused for just a second, glancing back, not at Richard, not at the crowd, but at the space where she had stood alone. And then she stepped in. Behind her, the formation snapped into one final salute, sharp and unified, the sound echoing into the open air. Inside the chapel, no one moved. No one followed. They just watched as the convoy began to pull away, one vehicle at a time, smooth, controlled, inevitable. Richard sank into the nearest seat, his hands falling to his sides, the reality settling in too late. The woman he had called a nobody had walked away with an entire force behind her, and she never looked back.